Jonathan Dusenberry walking you through my Understanding Library Research instructional module that I created for EDIS 710 and have built here into my John Tyler Community College Canvas sandbox course. It is not particular to the work that I am doing at John Tyler. This is just a platform in which I had a free LMS page to sort of build a course in, and though it is applicable and hopefully you'll see geared towards use in a variety of secondary and tertiary institutions, helping students understand the research process. Much of my inspiration, motivation for doing this work came out of my work with secondary students, helping them understand historical research and wanting to do a little more to support them in understanding how to evaluate and how to find and use, especially scholarly secondary sources. And so here you see this Understanding Library Research tab. This is the module into which I have built everything. And so here you can see the various pages and assignments. So let's begin at the beginning. We start with a discussion of types of sources. I have found that many students are somewhat familiar with the difference between a primary and secondary source, so they may need something of a refresher. And then often my introduction of a tertiary source is very new to them. And so I give just a very general introduction to understanding the differences in use of these three different types of sources. With the primary source being as close to the actual event as humanly possible, either original research, historical documents, things like that. Secondary sources being one step removed, which is an analysis of those intended to make an argument, and then tertiary sources being even further removed, intending to synthesize research and provide a narrative. And I point out that textbooks and reference books are generally tertiary sources. So often I find that students want to bring in their textbook, they want to bring in Encyclopedia Britannica, they want to bring in Wikipedia. There's a place for all of these sources, but I need them to understand exactly how textbooks and encyclopedias function in research, and that they are not secondary sources, especially scholarly secondary sources, in the way that I am looking for them. And here I just give a very general sort of rundown of types of primary and secondary sources that students might encounter. And so primary sources, again, are things that are as close to the original event as possible. So diaries, correspondence, original documents, case law, legislation, statistical data, journal article reporting on new research findings, often in the sciences, whereas secondary sources are journal articles that comment or analyze research, dictionaries, books that interpret, political commentary, biography, things like that. Right up front, we have a source recognition quiz. This is just to reinforce what they have done previously, that reading. And so it may seem like it comes very soon, and it does, but the intention there is that it will reinforce that work and also reinforce their understanding, and I do this by presenting them with a variety of research scenarios and varieties of sources, and then have them classify each of the presented sources as primary, secondary, or tertiary based on its relationship to the research scenario. And so let's just take a look here at what's going on inside. So you'll see that question 1, our scenario is you're researching the experiences of British soldiers during World War I, and the source that I provided is a book written by an American historian published in 1985. So based on what they have just read, they should see that this person is a scholar, but it is removed by both nationality and hopefully they'll see by year, since 1985 comes some 40 years after the end of World War, or not 40, comes nearly a century after the end of World War I. So they'll understand this is a secondary source, whereas here the scenario is the same, but we have a letter sent home from the front lines, even though it's by an American soldier, because it is sort of as directly related to the event as possible, they will see this as a primary source. And so on and so forth with a variety of different scenarios, the burial practices of Egyptian pharaohs and different sources, hieroglyphs, a book on Egyptology, so on. And so this is not just a test of knowledge, is an opportunity to implement their knowledge and understand the relationship between research scenarios, research topics, and sources, and sort of tease out what it might be the difference between a primary, tertiary, and secondary source. So moving back. Once they have completed that, We have a more formal discussion of varieties of secondary sources here called informational sources that pick up on the general list that I provided at the beginning, and tries to break each one down by currency, how recent it should be, the type of information that you would find, and where you might find it. And so we have journal articles, magazine articles, newspaper articles, monographs, aka scholarly books, nonfiction books, and differentiating between sort of a scholarly and a nonfiction book, I think, is very important for our students. Reference resources, and so these are sort of statistical resources and sort of raw data that have been put out by a variety of institutions. Textbooks, which are sometimes secondary sources. And then here, this concept of gray literature, which secondary students may not come across a lot, but I think college students do, and this is unpublished conference papers, presentations, technical reports, things like that. Just sort of thinking about where these fit in the sort of sense of how you can use them for research, and also sort of thinking about the capaciousness of our source database as we go about the process of doing research, where we can draw information from. And this is why I also include, where you might find it, because there's sort of a leap between knowing that this exists and knowing where students might need to look in order to identify and use this information. And here I break down the difference between scholarly, popular, and trade informational sources with just some highlighted bullet points here. And then also a little video that explains the process of peer review and why it's so important in understanding scholarly work, and how we distinguish between scholarly publication and trade publication in sort of peer review versus editorial review, and why that makes a difference in thinking about the quality of information that we find. And then here again, finding scholarly information sources, which we'll do a little bit more on, sort of that's the bulk of the rest of this module. But again, emphasizing that even if students know what these sources are, that doesn't mean they know how to find it. And so making that leap between knowing that the source exists and knowing where to locate it. And so here, just going through the idea of databases, OneSearch, which is a database that I use, or a collection of databases, a search engine that I use for a different institution, but sort of seeing the options of how we might go about doing this. And then again, popular and non-scholarly informational sources and trade and professional journals. So here we have an assignment that is scaffolded to help them understand the difference between a scholarly and a popular article. And so I presented them with two articles that cover the same topic, the idea of love at first sight. And in this assignment, their job is to evaluate the structure, not necessarily the content, but the structure of both of these articles in order to better understand the differences between a scholarly publication and a popular publication. And so we start just by looking at a very general overview of how to read each of these. And so we see here the column for scholarly and the column for popular, and sort of how we might break down the components of each of these articles. And so the scholarly, we're going to start with a summary. Scholarly articles will generally have an abstract, which popular articles do not. We'll have an introduction, which popular articles generally do not. Context, methods, analysis, just sort of seeing the extent of the components of a scholarly article, whereas a popular article tends to have more of a dearth and might have some background or brief literature review, maybe a description of method if such a method exists, but just really a discussion of the issue itself, whereas a scholarly article is far more systematic. And one of the things that I really emphasize that scholarly articles have that popular ones do not is this background literature review, background past studies. This use of primary sources will come up later, which popular articles do not have. Then they are able to read each of the popular, or each of the articles. This is written on eHarmony, which is obviously a dating website. The Perfect First Date by Steve Carter, someone who does have a PhD, and so can be considered an authoritative source, but thinking about why this is not a scholarly article, even if it is written by someone who may be a scholar. And so the article on The Perfect First Date. And then a scholarly, peer-reviewed article from the Archives of Sexual Behavior from Doctors Meston and Froelich on Love at First Fright, partner salience moderates roller coaster-induced excitation transfer. So obviously from that could be a very intimidating title for students, but then they can see, oh, well, it's going to start with a summary as we expect. There's a very systematic introduction. We can see that other studies are being cited. We can see that they very explicitly lay out how they went about doing their work. They present their results. And then they have a discussion of the significance of all of this. And once they have done that, or as they are doing that, they are able to fill out the scholarly versus popular article comparison chart just for their own edification. This is not something that I have put in as a grade, just an activity for them to complete so that they can sort of understand the structure and really the benefit of scholarly articles. A little further discussion of where we might find sources and why we should be using a library database for our sources, and sort of the key benefits of a library database as opposed to just using a website. And this, again, is related to the difference between scholarly and popular publications. And one of the things that we really emphasize, or that I really emphasize in this, is expertise, peer review. And so understanding library databases curate scholarly articles and provide them for students as part of the money that they pay to be students at the institution. And so that is legwork that has been done for them, as opposed to websites, which are of variable quality. And then ending this page with questions to ask about their information. The next is the library reference web quest. Now that they sort of know the benefit of library library databases, providing them with this web quest so that they can put that knowledge to use. If this were tied to a particular institution, I would do a little more scaffolding on the particular databases available to the institution and how students might go about using them, which you saw a little bit of earlier in the discussion of OneSource, but because it's not here, I just generally present the web quest itself. And so it's not as built up as it would be if I were modifying it for particular use in a particular institution. But for each of the topics below, I say use your library database searching skills to identify a scholarly journal article or monograph book for the topics given. Use an appropriate citation method. And so there are 15 topics listed, everything from white-collar crime to dietary supplements to United States-North Korea relations to contemporary young adult literature. And so for each of these 15 topics, I want them to identify a scholarly article of the sort that they just parsed on the idea of love at first sight. And then once they have done that work, to have a discussion with their classmates, which I had intended to be a Flipgrid discussion until I realized that Flipgrid requires you to input your students' email addresses whenever you create a discussion. And since this is based on a hypothetical group of students, I wasn't able to do that. And so had I been working with an actual group of students, I would have put in a video discussion based around this, giving them the opportunity to discuss the titles that they found in the process of locating them, and comparing the work that they did in locating this to the work that other students were able to do, and then comparing their relative and respective search processes in terms of databases, search terms, how articles caught their eye, and why they made the decision to include them among their lists. Finally, we have this very specific conversation about the role of sources, just as a summation and bringing together many of the strands that have been woven throughout this entire learning module, recognizing that students can feel overwhelmed by the amount of sources available to them, and thinking about what it is that they do with sources when they incorporate them into their research. Emphasizing that research isn't done in a vacuum, that most of them are not going to be researching, if any of them are going to be researching something that no one has talked about before, and that the first step of doing this is to understand what other people have said about it. So then going through that discussion, giving them again another sort of overview of how to read a secondary source pulled from a historian at Bowdoin College from 2004, with a way to make this process sort of less intimidating and more accessible for students who are new to the research process, just sort of breaking down and scaffolding how to go about reading a secondary source. And so this is for a monograph that we could do. If we were looking at an article, it could be, the bolded section headlines, and then looking at the various ways in which to read it. And then looking at, argument, does the author have a stake? And so this is going to come together in the final assignment that the students have, which is a secondary source analysis worksheet. And this is built off of the articles that they identified in their library reference web quest. Hopefully one of them struck their eye enough that the students would be able to then do this worksheet based on what they have done and using the guidelines in what they just read. So providing a citation, identifying the author and their credentials and also potential biases, identifying the author's thesis and argument. And so you'll see from the rubric that I provided from the student, one of the things that I want is for them to provide specific examples of where the author makes their argument, and what argument they are making, what primary sources the source relies on, and so emphasizing this idea that secondary sources are built on the use of primary source, and then analyzing the source. Do they find it reliable and convincing about the topic? Why or why not? And then how might this source relate to a project topic, and what does it add to what they already know about the topic that they looked into? And so it is absolutely my hope that by the time students have gone through this process, they would have a better understanding of the difference between sources, how sources are used, how sources relate to each other, and how to identify and evaluate sources, especially scholarly secondary sources, for a research project. And so I thank you for your time.